The actual, I will be waving frantically and nervous, and I'll be standing next to.
All right.
But hopefully, if it's the 25
if I've timed it
minutes,
right, we should get there.
yeah, we should have a couple of minutes for talk then. Yeah.
All right. Water.
It's, 5710 is all good.
These clickers are among the best inventions for presentations you can get. He's going there. I will go. That's right. Reset that time. No. PowerPoint's presenter mode is almost good, but just misses things like that. Like, I'm going to kill my clock without having to go back. Well, I want to be able to practice with that mode without actually having a second screen. Just knowing that there will be one.
It's hard to please everyone, I guess. All the different ways people want to use and collection of dongles for every possible situation.
And yet I'm betting they still don't have mine down here.
The ThinkPad? Is it mini HDMI or something?
No, it's DisplayPort, which no one has any love for. No, that's mini DisplayPort.
All right, it's about time to get started. The first talk in this session is by Dan Langer. He's going to give us a scenic drive through the Django request response cycle. Give him a hand.
Thank you. Merci. Bonjour, mes amis. My name is Dan Langer. I'm a developer and manager at Wave in Toronto. We're a startup that helps small businesses be successful with their online tools. And I'm going to talk about the Django request and response cycle, because that's where I spend the majority of my time when I'm working with Django. Now, I've been doing Django for about a little over 2 years, and Django does have a lot of moving parts. It's something I've come to accept, enjoy, deal with. But when you're starting out, it's not at all obvious how they all fit together. I was recently working with some guys on my team who were experienced devs, but Rails devs, and just coming to Django. And they went and were struggling with notions like, I have this variable, how do I get it into a template? Which appeared obvious to me, but apparently isn't, if you're coming from a background that doesn't have so many different layers of moving parts. So I'm going to talk about that, and in particular, how a request turns into a response, which I think is one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental, operations of Django. Now, speaking of all those moving parts, and without giving away the ending, this is somewhat how it all works. And it's grayed out for a reason, because we'll talk about it as we go through it. But you can see there's a lot going on here. There's a number of words repeated. There's sort of a U-shaped thing going on. There's the word middleware in a bunch of places. So let's talk about what this actually means. And if we're going to do that, we should start with a request, because it all begins there. So in a long time ago, in a console far away, in a galaxy called Toronto, someone typed this into their command prompt. They said, I want to curl out to danielanger.com/hello/mtl, and they pressed enter. And then they got this back. And this is curl saying what it's actually going to do, and that's what it's doing. It's sending a HTTP 1.1 GET request to /hello/mtl, saying I want a response from the host, danielanger.com, and I'm going to accept just about anything that comes back. And from there, it went across the internet. And I'm not going to talk about how the internet works, because that is a talk in and of itself, but trust me, when that person, being me in this case, pressed enter, the request did go out across the internet and ended up at something that looks like this at a data center, and what we're going to call a web server. Now, in practice, this web server is probably Nginx or Apache, but that's just who's popular nowadays. Bottom line is it's a web server. And the web server fundamentally takes a request and gives back out a response. Depending on how it does that, changes on what kind of request we're talking about. If it's a static request, if it's something simple, a file that's just on the machine, the web server will probably just handle it itself, stream the response back out, and get on with itself. But if it's more complex, if it's hitting something that's powered by a web application like Django, let's say, it gets a little more complicated. We have to ask the question, well, how does the web server itself, which may be written in C or something, how does that communicate with the Python process that's running Django? And this has changed in the past 10 years or so. Back in the day of the early 2000s, there wasn't a simple way to do it. Different web servers did it in different ways. Different frameworks did it in different ways. Some web servers supported ModPython. Some frameworks supported FastCGI. And it meant that your choice of web server and web framework was heavily coupled together, which both slowed innovation, and it pissed off web server people because they had to deal with framework people, and it pissed off framework people because they had to care about web servers. And nobody liked that. So what we ended up with was PEP 333 called WSGI, the Web Server Gateway Interface. And it's the answer to the question of how do Python frameworks and web servers interact in a common and simple way. And by web applications, I'm talking about things like Django. The big value of WSGI and PEP 333 when it came out was simplicity and easy to implement, because the guys who wrote it knew that if it wasn't simple and if it wasn't easy to switch, no one would actually do anything and we'd be left where we were. So they went and they made it simple, and they made one real entry point between your WSGI layer and your web server that the web server guys develop and your web application. And this is about your minimal possible WSGI compatible application. You can see the WSGI protocol, which is a callable, and I'm saying callable deliberately and not a function. A callable that takes two arguments, which have particular formats that the standard talks about, does some stuff to it, and then returns an iterable of strings. Now, WSGI is careful not to talk about how the web server actually deals with this. It just specifies that given this, it can run it in a particular way, and it will get back something that handles a web response. The other thing to highlight there is that there's nothing stateful in it. Every request has its own environ, has its own start response. There's nothing in there that lets, by definition, the WSGI keep track of one response to another. So any type of persistence, any type of session management has to happen down in the web application layer. Now, you're probably thinking, if I've said that WSGI is the way that web servers communicate with web applications, and if Django is a web application that runs, does it speak WSGI? The answer, of course, is yes. So in Django land, your WSGI layer is in Django.core.handlers.WSGI handlers. And with a couple things pulled off for simplicity, it looks something like this. If you look at the shape of it, compared to the last slide, it's very similar in that they are both callables. They both take two arguments, environ and start response, which are customarily called that but not defined in the server. And they both return something. In this case, the something is self.getResponse. And you can see that self.getResponse is really the meat of this thing. Self.getResponse itself, there are two interesting things about it. And we're going to spend a lot of time going into exactly how that function works. The first interesting thing is that it's not defined on WSGI handler itself. It's defined on base.baseHandler, which I thought was weird when I first started looking into this. But it turns out there's one other class in Django that subclass is base.baseHandler. Only one. And what that is the thing that runs the Django test client. So that when you're writing your integration tests, when you're firing off the Django test client, as much as possible, it's the exact same code path as you would get through WSGI. You go into your normal path. You just skip the WSGI handling layer. The other interesting thing about how this is structured is that self.getResponse takes a request object, which you'll see is not part of the WSGI standard. It's not environ or start response. A request object is something that's created in that first ellipses out area, and it's a Django structure that encompasses the request and everything that's needed to understand that request. This layer, Django.core.WSGI handlers, is the last place in Django that we actually deal with WSGI, so that the rest of Django below it doesn't care about how we got there. It just cares about what it needs in order to run. So jumping into core.base handlers, this is really what happens in getResponse. Base handler itself, basehandler.getResponse, is that main event loop of the request response cycle. So to understand how a request turns into response, it's really understanding how this works. And these are the sort of basic steps in it. But before we get into that, if we look at the list, we see that the word middleware is there a lot. In fact, on the 6 lines that are in there, the word middleware is involved in 4 of them. So let's take a brief digression to what I mean when I say middleware before we see what they mean. If you're coming from a more enterprisey background, When you hear middleware, you'll likely think something big, something heavy, something like Oracle Fusion or JBoss or InCommon, something that your boss's boss's boss bought for several $1,000,000. There's a department to run it, and it's generally a pain to deal with. We're trying to go for the exact opposite here in Django. The way the docs describe a Django middleware is it's a light, low-level plugin system for globally altering Django's input or output. The two interesting points there are globally altering and light. Light, you'll see as we get into looking at the structure of how these things are designed and how they're installed. And globally, because the really unique thing about middleware and the place in the Django ecosystem is that they run on every request that comes in and every request that goes out, whereas everything else gets funneled behind a view or a task or something. As an example of what light means, is installing a middleware is really just adding a line to a settings file. You'll find when you open up your settings file that comes in the project template, you've got a middleware classes dictionary. Add something to it, it'll get picked up. When you open it the first time, you'll see some things there. You should probably leave them there. They're pretty useful. But you should also add your own that you go through. So with that in mind, and with our thoughts around what middleware means in a Django context, let's look at the first step, which is your request middleware. A request middleware, what it's for is it handles things that happen on all inbound requests. And I say requests and not view calls because at the time we deal with a request middleware, we don't know how it's going to be handled. All we know is that there's a request that's come in through the WSGI layer down to here. And if we look at the structure of it, we'll see something that's going to repeat a few times. And the other epitome of what I said when middleware is a simple system. All the middleware is a plain old Django object that has a method process for request in it, which takes a request. And this is a pattern we'll keep seeing. And it can really return only one of two things. It can return either HTTP response, which is a full-on Django response object. And if it does that, the rest of the pipeline stops, and it goes there. And this usually happens if you've done your authentication in a Django request middleware, which is a good place to do it. If a user comes who's not authenticated, middleware would just shut down the process, redirect that user to a login page without having to go through any of the rest of the layers of the system. Or it can return none. And none is middleware's way of saying, I have no opinion on what's happening here. I've done my business, or I haven't done my business, but keep on going down the stack. So this middleware in particular, you can see just takes a request, which means it doesn't know the view that's going to handle this. And this is deliberate, because that's the stage we're at. If what you want to do in this request does require knowing what view will handle it, you could figure it out, but really you just shouldn't be doing it here. There's a later step in the process that we'll come to that's designed for that. So before we keep going, let's take a small break to catch up on where we are. We've gone and we started with a request that came from the client. The client did something, they pressed curl, or they went and used a web browser to click. That request went out, went across the internet, and landed on a web server. The web server took the request, parsed it, going through the WSGI layer, went down into Python, into Django, and in Django, the first step we've gone through is the request middleware. So at this point, we have a request object, and we have some stuff done to it. We haven't really done anything else with it, which is what's coming next. And the next thing up on the list is resolving that URL into a view that'll actually deal with it. Resolving a URL is the process, by definition, of taking a URL like DanielAnger.com/hello/mtl and mapping that to a view function that's going to handle it. If you're new to web frameworks or come from a background in static sites, you'd look at a URL like that at DanielAnger.com/hello/mtl, and you would think that somewhere below the web root was a directory called hello, and below that was a directory called mtl. Below that was an index file, which would show whatever you get in response to this. And that is how it would work, but that's not necessarily, in fact, almost certainly how it doesn't work in a Django application. At this point, in using URL resolution, all we really do, /hello/mtl, is just a mapping that we've chosen. And we can specify, using a format that looks something like this, what /hello/mtl does, and where it relates to, and the view function that gets used for it. We can, in this case, I've got a small pattern block at the bottom there in what's called a URL conf. And it shows two different ways you can make that mapping. The first one is simple. It's just saying, let's map /hello/mtl to hi_mtl view. It just does a direct string mapping. And the second one, though, is a little more complex. It's using a regular expression. And it's saying, I want to map /hello/anything alphanumeric to hi_city view. So if you made a request like /hello/Toronto, you would end up there. Now, The important thing is that these go in order, and that we resolve the URL that matches first wins. So if we switched our URL config to look like this is what it used to be, and we've now just switched the order of the two of them. In this case, /hello/mtl would go to high city view, because it comes in, it says, well, what does hello/anything map to? /hello/mtl matches this, so let's go deal with high city view. And nothing would actually get to high MTL view. Now, when we look at those patterns, I mentioned the first section, which is sort of the mapping key. I mentioned the second section, which is the view that gets handled by it. But the third section, the name equals high city, is something important. And it's a way that we can refer programmatically to what this URL looks like. What it does in referring to that URL, anywhere we're using it, using those two functions at the bottom of the screen, either the URL template tag or the reverse function, just referring to them that way means that we've decoupled the relationships between pages to the URLs themselves, which is an interesting idea and something you can't do with static pages, so I'll say that again. We've decoupled the relationship between two pages and the way that we generate the link between the actual content of the link themselves. So all we do is we call a reverse high city, and Django will give me what right now, based on how my URLs are set right now, the URL should be. Doing that means we can do something like this, and we can go and change our URL structure totally. We've changed hello to high city to Canadian high at the start of each URL, and now everything just still works because we've gone and everywhere we went and used a dynamic lookup using that template tag or that command to figure out the next URL. Things still go on. This is an odd thing, but trust me, you will find it very useful, and there'll be a couple times you'll thank yourself that Django does this for you. So with that out of the way, and seeing how those map, we can now go back and look at our URL conf again and see that /hello/mtl goes and matches to high MTL view. Now we figured that out, we're done with this step in the process. Now, next along the list, we've got view middlewares. View middleware is almost exactly the same thing as a request middleware, to the degree that we're not really going to go into it, except at this point, we now know the view object that'll handle it. So whereas a request middleware just took a request object, view middleware takes a request and a view object. In all honesty, I don't use these a lot. I've never actually built one myself. In searching through all the Django docs and examples, I found one good case of them, which is the way that Django handles CSRF. But it's there if you need it. And if you find yourself in that situation where you want your middleware to know something about the view itself, view middleware is the place you do it. But the real point and the real meat of the request response cycle, and where you'll do all your work, is the view function. Views are where logic lives. It's where you decide on your rendering system. It's where you go and make calls to databases and web services. And when we talked about URL resolution, we said that /hello/mtl mapped out to high MTL view. And this is about the simplest possible view that we could do to handle that. There's no magic going on here. It's just a function that takes a request object and returns something. In this case, the something is an HTTP response, which you just give it a string, and it will send back your right heading. It'll give you back a status code with it. But that's not the only thing that Django could respond with. Some other ones which you may find useful and end up dealing with, you've got your HTTP response redirect, which is if what you're trying to send back is a redirect somewhere else, and there's a different subclass if you want a 301 or a 302. There's a JSON response, which is just coming out 1.7, which is designed for if you're dealing with JSON. It just takes a dictionary. It will serialize things out properly. We'll send the right headers. There's nothing you can't do now, but it will save a couple lines in the process of when you're typing something out. And there's the streaming HTTP response, which is very much different from all the others. Whereas all our other response types, including the ones I haven't mentioned, take a full string or body of things to deal with. Streaming HTTP response takes an iterable, and it's designed for responses where you haven't yet figured out what you're going to send. You're giving an iterable so that once it gets back up to the top WSGI layer, that's where it'll keep calling the iterable and iterate through it. Now, on one hand, this is cool because it means you can have a very large or long-running response and not worry about filling up your memory. It's bad also because you can have a long-running response and not worry about filling up your memory. So with streaming HTTP response, it's there. It's an available tool for you. It will break a few other middlewares, but most of those handle it well. But think about what you're doing when you choose to use it. There's a few good cases for it, but a lot of good cases of when you think you're going to want to use this, what you should really be doing is looking at what you're actually trying to deliver and saying, well, is this better suited to put in a long-running task and email my users? Is this better suited to run offline and then give them a push notification? But if it's not, you've got the option. But for now, we're going to stick to HTTP response because it's simple and gets to the point. Now, I've called this a view function a few times because it is just a function. But that's not the only way you can write your view. Your other option is something that looks like this and is called a class-based view because it's a view that's based on a class, for lack of a better name. The defining features of that are they subclass Django.views.generic.view, and there's a function there called get, and there's one called post that defines the verbs you're trying to work on. Do you use function-based views? Do you use class-based views? If there's 10 people in the room, you've got 15 different answers. There is no one right one. Depends where you're at and what you're trying to do. I like class-based views, but I'm going to stick with function ones for the rest of this because they're simpler to deal with. So I mentioned in those last two views that what the views there aren't actually what we do. They're the simplest form, but they're not the form that you'd want to deal with because they were mixing HTML and Python into your same function blocks, which, while you're allowed to do that, you're going to have a bad time once you start to scale up, once you start to work with designers, once you try to do anything in your HTML beyond basic string interpolation. So what we've done here is set up using a template. And so it means that all our view does, and you can see what's in high MTL view now, it just sets up a dictionary context. In this case, saying a dictionary with the key city and the answer Montreal. And then passes that context down into a function called render, for which we've given a template as well using Django templating language. In it goes, the render function will take that template function, substitute city and Montreal into the right place, package it up into an HTTP response object, and return that. So this works, and this is a nice, simple way to do it. But let's say I want to get a little fancier. And now I've added a second thing to my Django template. I've said I also want to say hello to city from your request city. And I want to do that on every page of my site. So I could go through each of my views, add in that second line, request city equals GUIP.something, or some other vendor call where I figure out what city the request is in. But that gets annoying. It means I've got that same code everywhere in my site. It means I have to worry about it. It means that I've got all sorts of repetition where I don't need it. What I'd really like is something in the same way that a middleware works on all requests. I'd like something that works on all render calls, which does exist, and it's called a context processor. So template context processors are very simple. They really just look like a function that takes a request object and returns a dict. But the interesting thing and why they're useful is that they run on all request calls, or on all render calls, once you've added it to your template context processor list in your settings file. So if we've done that, then we can go back and our view and template will just look like this. In the view itself, all we have to worry about is setting the city variable. And because we know that in the context processor, later in the pipeline, it will handle figuring out what your request city is, pushing that in there. Now, at this point, I want to take one last pause before we keep going and go back up, talk about how we got here. But before I do that, please look at that picture. This place is called Schwartz's. It's about 20 minutes away. If it's your first time to Montreal and you've never been here before, please go here. It will be a cultural experience for you. It's also a very good sandwich. Order a large plate, medium fat, with a pickle, fries, and a black cherry. You're going to be tired afterwards, but you'll appreciate that you did it. So with that, and where I hope you all will go for lunch, let's step back and look at how we got to where we are. And we started with the client. We went across the client out again to the internet, to the web server, which communicated with Django and Python through the WSGI layer. We then hit the request middleware, went through URL resolution, dealt with the view middleware, and then dealt with the view itself. The view itself used Django templates, it templated it in, and then went through the context processor to template a couple other things in. And at this point, we're now in the last step in base handler, which is the response middleware. On the way in, at the beginning of middleware, I said that middleware was interesting. Well, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but in particular, it's interesting because it takes action both on the way in and on the way out. And by in and out, I also mean sort of down and up in this type of picture. On the way in, we use request middleware, we use view middleware, we use another type of middleware I didn't even mention because I've never used it before. But on the way back, we use response middleware. And if you look at the structure of it, it looks suspiciously similar to request middleware, which is, again, the whole point, that our middlewares follow a pattern, they're lightweight, and they're designed to be simple to understand. Response middleware is called with a fully formed response object, so at this point we know what we're returning, which may seem an odd thing when you want to hook in, but it's really useful for performance-related stuff. So one of the key response middlewares comes built in with Django, and it's called conditional get middleware. What that does is it takes your response that comes back out, adds a content length header onto it, and looks at the e-tags that came in with the request, and if your browser has a cached copy of this, it'll just go and erase the whole body of your response and replace it with a not changed response. So it's useful for things like that. It's also useful for cookie and session management. If you want to tack on an extra cookie field to set your cookie and refresh your token each time, you can do it there too. Now, the only thing that actually defines this as a middleware is it being an object with a process response method. So it's a reasonable question of could we combine that with the other middlewares? And the answer is yes. You can go and package up all your different middleware hooks into one object. In this case, we're going to call it PyCon middleware. So it works both as a request middleware, because it's got that process request method. It also works as a response middleware, because it's got that process response middleware. And this is really handy, except you've got to remember one thing, which is middleware is ordered. When I mentioned at the beginning, I said it's ordered, but this is really where that point hits home. On the way in, so when we're dealing with our request middlewares, our view middlewares, we process through this list top to bottom. So first we run common middleware, then CSRF view, and then our PyCon middleware. But on the way back, once we've already got our view, we run it from bottom to top. So first we'd run the PyCon middleware, then the CSRF view, and then common. And generally this will do the right thing, but not always. And it's important that when you're designing your middlewares and thinking about how they work together, you know that if you package them up into one object, you're limited to one spot in the order, whereas if you package them separately, you can exactly place them where you want. So the last step on our 5.5 step process through base handler is our friendly exception handler. And it's at the bottom, and it doesn't have a number because it's a little different. It is, whereas all our other middlewares will fire every time, exception middleware is designed to only fire if you've done something wrong, or really if you've done something wrong and haven't handled it yourself. So you'll only get an exception middleware if your view function itself calls an exception that you don't handle. And generally what you're going to use exception middleware for is tracking, is going and inserting something into your bug system. If you use Sentry, which I think has a boot downstairs, they hook in there to go and capture the exception so they can serialize it and send it out to their service. It only fires when something goes wrong. And it, like the others, returns none or HTTP response. But in this case, you almost always want to return the HTTP response. That's where you'd go and do something that handles it, redirect your user back to a sorry page. If you don't, and if you get through the middleware chain with just returning none for everyone, you're just going to end up with Django's basic 500 error page, which may or may not do what you want to do depending on your plan. So at this point, we're through Django. We've gone in, we've come through WSGI, we've gone down, we've gone back up. We've called the getResponse function, and the getResponse function has returned a thing, and that thing being an iterable of text. We've called startResponse, which is part of the WSGI standard, and we're returning it. And this takes it all back to the request that started this thing. At the beginning, we started with this first bit, and that was a curl request to the host, DJANGO.CORE.URLRESOLVERS, saying I want to do a get on /hello/mtl, and then I'm going to accept anything back. And then what we've given back is a 200 OK, which came from Django. We've said it's being served by Nginx, which is a web server. We've said it's got a content type of text HTML, which is great because we said we'd accept anything. It's got a content length of 33, which was provided by a Django response middleware, because you can do that after you've got the response. And it's got 2 lines. And the first line says Bonjour Montréal, when Montréal was templated in by our view function. And the second one says from Toronto, because that's where I was when I made the request. And that was templated in by a context processor. Now, this view itself is not that thrilling. There's not a lot to it. It says 2 lines of text. But that view itself is where you do interesting things. It's where you go and you call out to web services, and you call out to logic, and you use the stuff that Andrew Godwin and James Bennett and everyone else you've heard this weekend is going to talk about. But now, no matter how far you take Django, this is the basic structure of how your request will flow. You'll start at the client, you'll go out to the web server, you'll hit a web server of your choice, which will communicate using WSGI to get down into Django. Once you're in Django, you'll go through your request middleware,
You'll do URL resolution to figure out what view is going to handle it. You'll go through your view middleware, which you probably won't use, but you might. You'll go through your view function that actually does stuff. On the way back out, assuming you've done nothing wrong, we'll go back to our response middleware, where we'll set our content headers. Going through WSGI again, we'll go back to the web server, and then we'll send it back to the client, which is where we all started with. Thank you. If there are any questions, there is a microphone there. If not, thank you. I guess so. I'm going to get rid of all the rest of my junk here.